Okay, the next principle, and hey, look who it is again. It's Mr. Absurd himself, Mr. Magritte. The next principle is dealing with scale. Now, scale should not be confused with size. Size has to do with the size of a single object. Scale has to do with size relationships. So, in other words, the relationship of something to its surroundings or whatever. So, when we talk about scale, we're talking about a thing in comparison to the things around it. So, like in this case, the absurdness of this gigantic green apple in this room, this empty room with hardwood floors, obviously we're talking about it is way out of scale. There's never been an apple that big. If this green apple was seated on a small table in the middle of this room and painted at its actual normal size, then we would say it was to scale. It was appropriate. The scale was proper and accurate to our normal visual experience. In this case, the scale has been increased to the point that it not only becomes absurd, but it also deals with the, playing with size. If this was just a painting of that apple on a blank background, we would have nothing to reference it against. So scale would technically not play a part. Even if the apple was painted a little larger than life size, the painting itself would still not have much scale. Now, scale was used a lot to depict important things or important people. These types of ancient carvings, we saw the piece of size when it dealt with the pharaoh Tai on his hippopotamus hunt in the Elements PowerPoint. This is that hierarchical size, hierarchical scale. Hierarchy meaning order of importance. This leader was not actually a giant. He was just a king, a warrior. And so he was carved to be larger than any of the other human figures. Not because he had some genetic mutation, but because he was simply more important. The same thing here. Virgin Mary and child. This is the Byzantine era, early Christian 1300s, 1400s, 1200s. The people around Mary are not little proportioned people. It's just showing that she's more important and Christ is more important. The Tiantan Buddha, also known as the Big Buddha, man, no kidding. Scale, very important. I don't know if you can recognize it, but this little dot person right here, that's a human being standing there. There's another human being going up the steps, and that's how big this sculpture is. Again, importance, being looming, menacing, or, all powerful. And we in the United States, we have our own large scale monkeys. We have Mount Rushmore. Those four people did not have heads that big. We placed them on an entire mountain, much to the chagrin of the Lakota Sioux Nation, and made them massive to show how important those four men were to United States history. Now, in this case, scale is used to bring something out of its normal context. This is part of the pop art movement, and pop art focused on taking the average, everyday, unimportant, consumable, whatever, of the United States especially, and try and elevate those things to what they considered high art. Their idea was that even the lowly comic book or the soup can, these kid books, these insignificant war stories, or this can of soup that you're going to pour in a bowl and throw the can away, that all of that stuff, Brillo pads, whatever, if you presented it properly, it could surpass what its original intent was of just being a consumable product. Now it became something much, much more. It became large, okay? It became, it loomed over you. Now, first thing I want to tell you is this was done in 1963 before we had large format printers. This was hand painted, so every one of the little Ben-Day dots that were used to make a comic book were hand painted by the artist Lichtenstein. So all these dots and all this texture that they used to color a comic book, he did it with paint. To give you an idea of how taking this one or two panels from a comic and blowing it up, it is 5 feet tall and 13 feet wide. So when you go into a room with this thing, it is basically the entire wall. It's as big as you are. And so all of a sudden, this comic book, this insignificant panel from this comic book, has been made massive. It would be if you walked into a room and there was a sneaker the size of a boat. It would be weird. That's it for scale. This little lecture goes pretty quick. So, the next principle that artists use is something called balance. Stability, which results when visual elements on one side of a work seem to, quote, weigh as much as those on the other side. This is talking about visual weight, not actual weight. The appearance of heaviness or lightness of forms, the amount of visual stimulation in each side. So, in other words, if you had a 10-foot wide canvas, but you did your whole painting in the bottom right corner, then it's going to feel heavy to the right. Now, that I said the key word there, it's more about feeling than about with numbers. So in other words, you may have 6 large human figures painted on the right side, and then off in the distance on the left side there may be a giant army, but all the soldiers are fairly small. Well, you're still going to feel balanced because you've got 3 or 4 or 6 large figures on the right, and they're very prominent, detailed, close to the viewer. Or you've got 100,000 figures on the left, but they're all the size of pinheads. It's going to even out. So, when we are children, the very first form of balance we recognize is symmetry. That has a lot to do with the fact that human beings are symmetrical creatures. We have a midline, 2 eyes, 2 nostrils, a left and a right, same hands, legs, all that stuff. So symmetry is something that the human brain latches onto quickly. We start to see this is the same on the left as it is on the right. It's the same on the top as it is on the bottom, and so on and so forth. So a lot of our stuff, that's why we get in the bad habit as children to just start drawing in the middle of a page. Now, symmetrical balance assumes a central, vertical, or horizontal axis in a work of art. I didn't include horizontal. We as children will put our hand and they'll have you do finger paint, and they'll have you put your hand in some paint, and you'll put your hand on the right side of the paper and then fold it, and it'll make a reversed copy on the left side of the paper, and you smile and you bring it home to your mom and she puts it on the fridge. Okay? So this kind of symmetrical stuff, while still vitally important and vitally used, is a very important thing for artists to think about. Even the Amish, who lead a very plain, humble existence, when they make their quilts, they not only explore explosive amounts of color, which you may not accept from a group of people that prefer to be toned down, but also rhythm and pattern. Amish quilts are some of the most American-made items in the world, truly, truly American, and unique to America, that they are considered works of art in their own right. The ancients, this is, anywhere from 2500 to 2000 before the Common Era. Neolithic New Stone, the Second Stone Age. These were little deities, little gods and goddesses from the Cycladic islands of Greece, and they're all extremely symmetrical. And they understand the human figure is, exact on both sides, at least in their eyes. Now, we all know that we're not. There is asymmetry in human anatomy. One arm shorter than the other and stuff like that. But to uneducated, unscientific people, we were split right down the middle, as were all of the, mammals, fish, most insects. Only plant life gets really asymmetrical. Now, the other thing that you can use is something called asymmetry. In other words, both sides are not exactly the same. However, with an asymmetrical balance, you're dealing with things like positive and negative space, which we talked about in the last section when we were talking about shapes. We talked a lot about, what is the positive space, what is the negative space, and, and how you balance them, like this famous woodcut from the Japanese artist Hokusai. It is almost a rectangular version of the yin-yang symbol. We have this large blue wave crashing and wrapping around, but if you were to flip this painting upside down, this area over here is mimicking the wave. And see, this area here is mimicking this part. So it's all about balancing that perfectly. Had the artist not raised the wave here or lowered the wave there, the flip wouldn't have worked. Asymmetrical balance can be achieved via various approaches. Physical asymmetry, which is what we just talked about, positive space is equal to the negative space. We talked about the size of object, having maybe one large object versus several smaller objects on the opposite side. And then there are things like contrast in values and in colors. Okay, now this is taking balance very literal. With this sculpture by Noguchi, this large metal concrete cube standing on its corner looks like it could topple over at any second. So the illusion of this massive, heavy thing looking like it's about to fall over, obviously it's taking the word balance very literally. Not to worry, though, there's about a 30-foot pole of solid steel that goes down below the ground that holds this thing up. Okay, let's go ahead and take a break from the principles for this video, and then I will start the next section in a new video.